Hello, I'm Eric Horvitz, Chief Scientific Officer at Microsoft. Welcome to the first Digital Content Provenance Summit, hosted by the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity. An informed citizenry is the foundation of democracy. Unfortunately, the act of creating and distributing disinformation to mislead, persuade, and sow division is not new. But over the last 5 years, advances in machine learning and graphics have led to the general availability of surprisingly powerful tools for modifying and synthesizing digital content. Content that is so realistic, it's extremely difficult to distinguish fact from fiction. The proliferation of tools for generating deepfakes and also to make lighter weight edits and manipulations threaten to cast doubt on the veracity of all digital media. C2PA was founded 1 year ago as a standards body to help build back trust and transparency in digital content, to address not only deepfakes, but also other disinformation tactics, such as the use of photos or snippets of video from long ago as breaking news. Today, the members of C2PA, Adobe, ARM, the BBC, Intel, Microsoft, TruePic, and Twitter celebrate a major milestone with the release of a content provenance specification, the world's first open standard for certifying digital content provenance. Now, some have hoped that we might thwart the flow of synthesized or manipulated digital content by using AI methods to detect artifacts or irregularities. Now, the problem is that AI methods that are used to create and detect deepfakes are the same. So we end up in an AI versus AI scenario where AI cannot reliably win. Thus, we realized the need to develop a different kind of approach, and this led to innovation with content authentication. The specification we're announcing today will foster the creation of interoperable tools for media provenance, enabling content creators to cryptographically certify the source and history of changes made to digital assets like images and videos, and to confirm that content has not been tampered with. The methods work by immutably embedding information about the media and its source and history as metadata that travels along with the digital content. Now, these methods will not solve the deepfake and broader disinformation threats on their own. It's going to take a multi-pronged approach, including education aimed at media literacy, awareness, and vigilance, investments in quality journalism with trusted reporters on the ground, locally, nationally, and internationally, and new kinds of regulations that penalize malevolent actors who generate or manipulate digital content with an aim to deceive. However, I see today's announcement and the technologies that will flow from it as a significant step forward in injecting a new layer of resilience and trust into the digital content that we see. Now, none of this would be possible without the cooperation and productivity of the multi-party C2PA standards body, which initially brought together top talent from two complementary projects, the Content Authenticity Initiative and Project Origin, and then expanded to include additional stakeholders, including hardware manufacturers, broadcasters, news agencies, and providers of software and services. Now, we recognize that restoring trust in digital content is an ambitious goal that will require diverse perspectives and participation. We're encouraged to see industry, nonprofit organizations, research institutions, and governments embracing the content provenance approach. In the United States, I was excited to see the bipartisan introduction by Senators Portman and Peters of a bill on digital content provenance. The National Security Commission on AI, a panel that I served on, examined and reported on ways that U.S. government agencies and the nation more broadly could leverage digital media and provenance about the media to mitigate the rising challenge of synthetic media. And in Europe, several national and EU initiatives have been launched around introducing digital content provenance into legislation. Today, you'll hear from experts in government, academia, media, and technology on this approach, its benefits, and its limitations. We'll also show previews of how the methods work and how their use can be scaled across the internet. I urge everyone in the business of capturing, creating, and transmitting news and information to take a careful look at this development. I also encourage institutions, companies, and organizations to join us, to engage, contribute, and to help us to continue to refine and extend an open standard that will foster transparency and increase trust in what we see and what we hear online. We'll next turn to a discussion on disinformation, deepfakes, and the potential for leveraging content provenance to enhance national and global security with Lindsay Gorman, Senior Policy Advisor for Technology Strategy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. Lindsay will be joined by Dana Rao, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Adobe. But first, it's my pleasure to share comments via video from Ohio Senator Rob Portman and Michigan Senator Gary Peters, co-sponsors of the Senate's Deepfake Task Force Act. Please roll the video, and then we'll turn it over to Dana and Lindsay. Thank you.
Hi, I'm U.S. Senator Rob Portman. I'm really pleased to be with you all today, and I thank Adobe and the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, C2PA, for this invitation to join you. I can't be with you in person, but know I'm with you in spirit. At a time when Americans' trust in the media and their trust in so many institutions continues to lessen, I'm continuing my work to try to help reverse this trend. I don't need to remind anyone in this crowd about the dangers of malicious online content and how that leads to distrust. One of the particular problems are deep fakes, these hyper-realistic AI-generated content depicting events that actually did not occur. Already deep fakes, which are unfortunately sometimes used against unsuspecting women in the form of pornography, are causing great harm in our communities. This is why we need to make fighting deepfakes a priority now and in the future. As the co-founder and co-chair of what's called the Senate Artificial Intelligence Caucus, and as the top Republican on the Senate Homeland Security Committee, I'm pleased to help lead this good fight against deepfakes and to promote the authenticity of online content. Thanks to your help, in the last administration, President Trump signed our Deepfakes Report Act into law. It was back in 2020. It was one of the first deepfakes bills to ever make it to the president's desk. In the wake of that success, I've been honored to work closely with Dana Rao and teams at Adobe, TruePic, and other C2PA members to introduce new legislation to help develop standards for digital content provenance. As you know, digital content provenance will help improve our ability to identify deepfakes quickly. But widespread adoption of digital content provenance requires putting the best minds in government, industry, and academia together. That's the aim of the Bipartisan Deepfake Task Force. This Task Force Act, which I introduced with my Homeland Security partner Gary Peters, will really help. Thanks to your support for the Deepfake Task Force Act, the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee passed this bill unanimously. Success like that proves what I've said before, and we'll say it again, the issue isn't bipartisan. It's nonpartisan. I'm pleased that we can still find common ground to tackle some of these big emerging threats facing our country, and this is one of them. So again, thanks for all your support of our efforts to combat AI-enabled disinformation online. I may only have a year left in the Senate, but I look forward to working with you to pass the Deepfake Task Force Act and to end this year on a high note. Thanks again for the invitation to join you, and more important, Godspeed in your important work.
Hello, I'm U.S. Senator Gary Peters, and I'm honored to be part of your conference today as you discuss a critical national security issue, the use of deepfakes to spread disinformation. We used to be able to say, seeing is believing, and if you watched video footage with your own eyes or heard an audio recording with your own ears, then it must be real. But as we all know very well, as technologies like artificial intelligence and machine learning become more advanced and more accessible, their potential to be used to manipulate or to even completely fabricate digital content also increases. Coupled with the tools like social media, forged content could spread like wildfire and be used to undermine public trust or cause public confusion and fear. And that certainly poses a serious national security threat. As chairman of the Homeland Security and Government Affairs Committee, I've worked alongside my colleague, Senator Rob Portman, to help ensure that the federal government is prepared to address the possible threats posed by deep fakes and the unique way that they can spread disinformation. In 2019, our Deepfakes Report Act was signed into law to require the Department of Homeland Security to conduct regular assessments of deepfakes and related disinformation efforts, and how our adversaries may try to use them to undermine our national security. This year, we're working to build on that legislation with our bipartisan Deepfakes Task Force Act, which has already been unanimously approved by my committee. This important bill will give the Department of Homeland Security additional tools to address the threats posed by deepfakes. It creates a task force made up of experts from government, academia, civil society, and industry, who would be charged with creating a coordinated plan to explore how the creation of digital content provenance standard could help prevent the spread of deepfakes and disinformation. The task force would also be responsible for helping to develop tools for content creators to authenticate their content and help DHS and other leaders to better inform consumers about the source of deepfakes. I certainly look forward to continuing to work with Senator Portman and working together to build on the work that you do today and every single day to help ensure that we are prepared to take on this dangerous and evolving threat. So thank you for being pioneers on this critical issue, and I hope you all enjoy today's discussion.
Everyone, I'm Dana Rao, Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Adobe. Thank you for joining us today. I'm going to be really excited to have this conversation with Lindsay Gorman, as you heard Dr. Horvitz mention. First, I have some remarks, because that's what we do here. We all have some things we want to say. But as Dr. Horvitz said, this is a really important day. The release of the C2PA open standard is an important milestone in the journey towards restoring trust in online content. Because today's release really means that everybody, software companies, social media platforms, can start building trust into their tools right now. And this is critical because we all as a society need to be able to trust what we see, what we hear, what we read. And then the C2PA's release of today's technical standard 1.0 is a critical step on that journey. Just 1 year ago, Adobe and other industry leaders came together to form this coalition. And I want to recognize all the members of the C2PA, especially the steering committee, which includes, of course, Adobe, but ARM, BBC, Intel, Microsoft, TruePic, and Twitter, for all the hard work that has come to making this vision of an open digital content provenance standard a reality. And it's just really exciting because being able to leverage our joint technical expertise among these companies and the learnings has allowed us to create something that's really going to work in our products and our tools. And that's the benefit of a standard that is created by and for industry. We know what the problems are. We know how to solve them. And 3 years ago, we created the Content Authenticity Initiative, Adobe, Twitter, and the New York Times. And that was sort of a forerunner of part of the work that's in the C2PA. And that was to have provenance technology adopted into our products and solutions. And that's in Adobe's products today, like Photoshop and our social media platform, Behance, and our stock photography service, Adobe Stock. So that technology is already out there and in the CAI form. And CAI is a C2PA compliant version of provenance technology. And it's great. It's exciting to have an actual implementation of the standard already out in the industry. But we're going further than that because it is critical that this technology proliferate. And that's why we're also creating an open source version of that is C2PA compliant of our content authenticity technology. So anyone can easily build the C2PA standard into their tools and technologies, whether or not you have the resources of a big tech company like Adobe does, or you're a small outfit, you're going to be able to do that because we're going to provide an open source implementation of this. And because it's open, this is free for everyone, because this is a problem we're all getting together to try and solve for the benefit of everyone, because this is a critical problem, right? As you're going to hear us talk about, and you heard, right? In this era of misinformation, the premise of providing authenticity in their content is more important than ever. We have to give people the tools they need to decide who and what to trust. Allowing creators to prove what's true instead of being caught in an endless game of cat and mouse trying to guess what's not is the right strategy. And that's what CAI and C2PA do. And we want to put the decisions in the hands of the people to decide what's true or not, because nobody wants tech companies or governments being the arbiters of truth around the world. But there is a critical role for governments to play. And that's why we've been working with Senators Peters and Portman on the Deepfake Task Force Act. And I'm very excited to be joined today by Lindsay Gorman, Senior Policy Advisor for Technology Strategy at the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. OSTP, as everyone knows it by, much easier to say. Lindsay's a physicist and computer scientist by training, spent over a decade at the intersection of technology development and national security policy, specializing in building a democratic approach to emerging technologies such as AI and machine learning. So Lindsay, thank you for being here today, and I'm excited to hear your perspective on digital content provenance and more generally from your perspective, the issues of mis and disinformation. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dan.
We're wanting to kick it off with a question about the Summit for Democracy, which you helped drive. So you organized a really interesting discussion on innovation as part of that Summit on Democracy and Content Authenticity Initiative, and the C2PA was actually part of that conference in terms of having a demo and showing people what's possible with technology. When you think back on that Summit for Democracy, what role do you see provenance playing in supporting democratic values and restoring trust in content online?
Thank you, Dana, and to Adobe and to the members of the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity for inviting me to the launch of this important standard, an open standard, I might add, and also for the contributions of the Content Authenticity Initiative to the Biden administration's work to advance technology for democracy in the context of the Summit for Democracy. Last month, as you pointed out, the administration convened 100 governments worldwide to re-entrench our commitment to democracy, and one of the key pillars of the landmark Presidential Initiative for Democratic Renewal was advancing technology for democracy. In the face of significant challenges and also opportunities, this administration is committed to fostering a technological ecosystem that promotes transparency and accountability and that reflects our democratic values. Reflecting on the session that you mentioned on democracy-affirming technology, where we were grateful for the Content Authenticity Initiative's participation, our aim is to make and use technology and innovation to support democratic values. And reflecting back on sort of how we got to this point and where we are today, I think in the early internet era, there was a somewhat naive belief that new technologies would be inherently democracy affirming, inherently democratizing or liberalizing, that they would automatically support democracy over autocracy as a form of governance and a system of values. Today, we know that technologies like artificial intelligence, social media, and even the internet itself are being exploited to repress, divide, and discriminate against people. And authoritarian actors are weaponizing them to advance their objectives and to advance autocracy. As the director of the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Eric Landers, said at that session, our task is to forge a better path. And so one initiative we've launched is a series of international grand challenges on democracy-affirming technologies. And so what are these technologies? These are technologies that can be used to affirm democratic values, that is, offer the opportunity, the potential to be used by democracies to support democratic values of privacy, equity, equal opportunity, fairness, free expression, truth and transparency, accountability, inclusion, openness, respect for the rule of law, and respect for human rights. And our aim is to give democracies, not autocracies, a competitive advantage in this new technological landscape. So we're looking at technologies like privacy-preserving artificial intelligence and the ability to train machine learning systems without compromising individual privacy. We're thinking about internet access in new ways in peer-to-peer networks and anti-censorship technologies. And we're asking whether we can use technology like digital content provenance to help bring transparency and accountability to online content so that users can tell deep fakes and cheap fakes from what's real and authentic. To that end, I'm honored to be celebrating the launch of this open standard, which has the potential to democratize the building of trust by capitalizing on a core democratic value, and that's transparency. Something you, Dana, said both today in your opening remarks and also in that Summit for Democracy session in the video from the Content Authenticity Initiative that really has rung true is that neither governments nor tech companies should be the arbiters of truth. That power rests with users in deciding who to trust. And this open standard gives stakeholders from across the content creation, editing, and display ecosystem the ability to demonstrate that trust to users and to provide a credible way of making truthful, trustworthy, credible information look qualitatively different from mis and disinformation. As President Biden said in his speech at the Summit for Democracy, democracy doesn't happen by accident. And to that, I would add that technology that works for democracy doesn't happen by accident either. We have to build it that way and shape it that way to ensure our values are represented in our technologies and that the playing field of technological competition is conducive to those values.
Thank you. That is really inspiring to hear the investment that the Biden administration is making in this critical issue. Very exciting to hear about the grants and the way you're trying to drive innovation that is sort of pro-democracy, preserving and founded on the values of transparency and trust, which is absolutely the same values that we're trying to promote here with C2PA. So it's really exciting. When you think about the threat of misinformation to democracy, how serious do you think it is, and how do you frame that as a problem?
Absolutely. I think, it's definitely one that is top of mind, I think, across government, civil society, industry. And in keeping with this commitment to democracy, the Biden administration certainly recognizes that our very democracy depends on the free flow of ideas and on informed public discourse, and that the digital revolution has the potential to foster these elements of democracy. But absent that sustained care and commitment to shared standards, as this group well knows, emerging technologies can be used to spread disinformation, to sow mistrust, and to undermine and repress fundamental rights and freedoms. And so in today's information age, critical decision-making across all sectors really depends on access to accurate and trustworthy information. Information that is knowingly or unknowingly manipulated or disseminated for political, ideological, or commercial gain is a grave threat to democracy, to security, and also to our economic prosperity. And the integrity and authenticity of information is really central to a shared understanding of the world around us, which in turn is central for democratic function. As we speak, to sort of give some color to these issues from around the world, as we speak, volunteers in Hong Kong are seeking to digitize and document the reporting of the many independent media outlets that have been silenced by the People's Republic of China and Hong Kong authorities targeting of free press. On the other side of the world, European civil society groups are working to identify and expose Russian disinformation and document Russian aggression. And the reason this is really a national security challenge, in addition to a societal one, is that without technologies that help to protect and authenticate information, authoritarians can rewrite history and avoid being held to account. New technological advances have enabled manipulated information to reach vast audiences around the world at an unprecedented speed, which undermines public trust in the integrity of information and can have potentially devastating consequences. So I think as a government, we need to expand how we communicate with the public, including in communicating the risk of manipulated content so that individuals can make informed decisions. And to that end, we're finding new ways to encourage increased research and collaboration across civil society, the private sector, and governments. And one initiative in this space that we also announced last month is that the White House announced an interagency information integrity research and development working group to develop and release a first-of-its-kind strategic plan concerning government-wide R&D to better understand the full information ecosystem and design strategies for preserving information integrity and mitigating the effects of information manipulation, including mis and disinformation, and foster this multidisciplinary and also collaborative research environment. The national security challenge is one facing the whole of society, and that requires cooperation among governments, industry, civil society, which is why efforts in the technology sphere to bring those stakeholders together around this shared challenge are so vital.
That's great. Again, it's just great to see the focus and energy put on this issue. When we think about it, when we've talked about the issue in the past, we've always said, we have two problems. You have the problem of people get deceived by the lies, and then you have the problem that once they realize they're being lied to, they don't believe the truth anymore either. And if you don't have either of those things, then it's really hard for a democracy to operate. We operate on facts, and we have to agree on some shared set of facts, and we can fight about the policy all day long. But if you can't agree a forest fire happened, you'll never get to whether or not it was climate change or a man-made fire. Like, you can't even get to that question if you don't even agree that the thing happened in the first place. So it's really critical. And as society gets more digital, right? Everything becomes digital. All the information becomes digital. It's really hard to parse out what's true and not, and especially with things like images and audio and video, or even send this out to the metaverse where everything is a 3D artifact that's been created. Hard to understand what you can believe and what you can't believe. So it's really getting an anchor into that right now is so important. When you think about the U.S.'s efforts, and you've talked about the grant program for trying to address some of the global issues, but really this is a global problem, right? We could try and solve it in the United States and feel good that we did something, but it doesn't mean anything if we're just being flooded with misinformation from everywhere else. And so how do we think about ensuring countries and corporations around the world are aligned in kind of a unified way of addressing this problem?
Yeah, Dana, it's a great question. And in addition to not being able to sort of solve it in one place alone, I think it's also a challenge that many countries and governments, industry, civil society actors around the world are facing together and at the same time, and is really one that benefits from lessons learned and sharing information across those actors, because many of the challenges that we're facing are really similar to those that our democratic partners are facing. And so we've done a little bit of work over the past year to really beef up our technology alliances and technology coalitions with our like-minded partners around this issue and others in the broader suite of technology competition and making technology work for democracy through initiatives like the US-EU Trade and Technology Council in Europe, where we're partnering with the European Commission on a whole host of trade and technology issues, including one of relevance to this group on the misuse of technology to threaten security and human rights. And so we're working closely with our European partners to guard against that misuse. In the Indo-Pacific, we've breathed new life into the Quad partnership with Australia, Japan, and India, and we've agreed to shared principles for the design, development, and use of technology. And then also through the Trade and Technology Council, we've committed to developing a shared understanding of what trustworthy AI is with our European partners. And so that work is underway, recognizing that we certainly in the US government do not have all the answers by any means, and perhaps not even in the US, which is not to give any short shrift to the excellent work that our colleagues at DARPA, and Matt Turek, who's going to be on the panel following this conversation, are doing, but really that this needs to be a global and collaborative effort. And sort of taking that to the next step at the Summit for Democracy and this year of action that we have coming out of that summit, we are undertaking aims to bring in that really global view, and speaking from the perspective of what technology and innovation can bring to bear on this question. One initiative as part of our Grant Challenge series that we're really excited about is the Global Entrepreneurship Challenge, led out of the State Department and U.S. Embassy Madrid in partnership with a Spanish university, where our goal is really to spur innovation globally in technologies to advantage democratic values, like those designed to counter misinformation and disinformation through a set of regional startup and scale-up competitions in countries spanning the democratic world, recognizing this is not just a problem unique to the developed world, but really has a global footprint. And I would say we also recognize that technology is but one aspect of the solution, and that guardrails and norms around technologies, as well as work on the broader information ecosystem, such as support for public interest media, must also be a part of the solution. And so last month, we announced a commitment to a new international fund for public interest media, and the U.S. Agency for International Development is launching a media viability accelerator to improve the financial stability of independent media outlets in both underdeveloped and more developed media markets. So there is really no one size fits all here, I think, as many of you know, but our view is that innovation also has a very important role to play in this ecosystem, both within our domestic context, but also internationally.
Education is critical, so I'm glad to see the focus on the public interest campaign as well, because people need to know that what's out there may not be what is true, and they also, when we finally have tools out there that can help solve the problem, they need to know about those too, right? And so all of this public interest is sort of that digital literacy that is so critical for society. It's great to have the government's work there. When you think about maybe putting your computer science hat back on, when you think about an open technical standard, what comes to mind when you think about the advantages of having an open technical standard as a way to lead forward on a cause like this versus maybe a top-down version that maybe with your White House hat back on, a government approach which is more top-down? Like, how do you see this playing in? How do they work together?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think and thank you for highlighting sort of the open nature of this standard. It's a really important one to keep in mind, that this digital content provenance standard is open, meaning that anyone can view it and anyone can implement it, a process which is inherently democratizing, paving the way for both competition and for bleeding edge technology to be adopted by anyone. So I think that's a really crucial piece of this, and it is a mode we've seen success in with, another area of what I call democracy affirming technologies, which are anti-censorship tools and peer-to-peer connectivity solutions. And so one of the challenges we're launching in partnership with the Open Technology Fund to counter censorship in denied environments, which is kind of perhaps the flip side of misinformation and disinformation, is kind of access to information at all. And the Open Technology Fund develops tools that are open source by their nature, which is especially important when we think about building trust, so that transparency is baked in by design. And I think goes with this theme of, you don't necessarily have to trust, the governments or the big tech companies. You can kind of look under the hood yourself. And I think that's really the value of an open standard, especially when you're trying to build transparency and build trust, as this effort is. And so I think, through this effort, we're really calling on entrepreneurs, visionaries, researchers, innovators from across society and around the world to help build a more democratic future by driving technological innovation to support democratic values.
It's great. I mean, it's great to hear this. I think maybe my last question for you is on elections. I think a lot of people look at this as one of the primary problems caused by misinformation is election integrity. And so when you think about going forward in elections to come, how do you see this? How do you see the potential misinformation as a problem? And then how do you think about digital provenance technology as being part of that solution for election integrity?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing in the disinformation space that obviously gets a ton of attention is around elections and the selection of political leaders, which is absolutely crucial and is one of probably if not the core feature of democratic societies and democratic governance. And so misinformation and disinformation that threaten our electoral systems are certainly grievous threats to democratic values and to our democracy. I think, as is the more perhaps more under the surface threat of misinformation and disinformation, even outside of electoral context. Sort of this pervasive undermining of the ability to distinguish fact from fiction is really critical, I think, at all times. And so I don't know, I'm really excited to hear about this progress with the C2PA has made in the release of this open standard. And I'm eager to see how it develops and how that sort of democratization of access both helps with adoption and also can spur creativity into novel ways of building trust in our digital ecosystems, in elections, but also in the broader information ecosystem and some of the national security challenges that we face with our authoritarian actors. And maybe just to conclude, I would say that if technological progress teaches us anything, it's that nothing for good or for ill is set in stone. And every generation of technology is a new opportunity to re-envision and reimagine the role of technology in civic life and in this struggle between democratic and autocratic forms of governance. So thank you again for the opportunity to share some of our vision and to congratulate the C2PA on this important work towards a technological future that can advance our deepest held values.
Thank you, Lindsay. We really appreciate you taking the time to come out, and we frankly even more appreciate the focus you've been able to put at the White House and the Biden administration on this issue for all of our goods. One thing I would say to the audience in closing is this is a problem for everybody. It's not a technology problem. It's not a government problem. It's not a media problem. It's every citizen has an obligation and the ability to influence our ability to communicate in a trustworthy and transparent manner. And so you have a role to play. Everyone has a role to play, and we welcome you in to the tent to help solve the problem. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, good evening, depending on where you're dialing in from. Thank you for joining us on this panel today on why media provenance matters. As we've already heard from some very interesting remarks, and we know from personal experience that we exist in an increasingly corroded information ecosystem in which falsified and manipulated digital content has become ubiquitous. And of course, as we enter the age of deepfakes and synthetic media, which is my expertise, this trend will increase exponentially. Already, it's estimated that 90% of video content online by 2030 could either be synthetically manipulated or generated by artificial intelligence. So detecting everything that's fake or manipulated is an impossible task, simply because it's not scalable. So how do we ensure that we can trust what we see and hear online, rather than only thinking about detecting fakes or deepfakes? A more holistic approach to visual trust in our digital information ecosystem must also include being able to establish the provenance of a piece of content, i.e., where did it come from? Who owns it? Is it authentic? How has it been manipulated? How has it been edited? In short, this approach is known as digital content provenance. It's what this entire event is about today, and it's something that the Coalition for Content Provenance and Authenticity, the C2PA, and its members have developed an open standard for in less than 1 year. Now, this open standard unlocks the potential for adoption by any platform, any website, or any organization across the internet. So this is a potentially game-changing advancement that will help to reestablish trust in what we see and hear online. So to discuss the significance of this technology and the open standard, I am really delighted to welcome an incredibly esteemed panel today. And I'm afraid I won't have time to list all their achievements because we would be here all day if I did that. So please do engage with their work outside of this event. But for now, suffice to say that they are all pioneers in thinking about how to build a safer information ecosystem for posterity. Their work spans academia, business, policy, national security, and humanitarianism. We have Dr. Hani Farid. He is a professor at UC Berkeley and an expert in digital forensics, misinformation, and human perception. Sam Gregory is the program director at Witness, a phenomenal international nonprofit that helps citizens use video and technology to protect human rights. Todd O'Boyle is the senior manager of public policy at Twitter, where he's in charge of election security. And last but by no means least, Dr. Matthew Turek, the program director at DARPA's Information Innovation Office, which is the R&D vehicle for US national security. So welcome to you all. But perhaps we could really just start by identifying the scale of the problem here, just going back to first principles. Why is it that we need media provenance? And I'll start with you, Matt. At DARPA, I know you've been leading an incredibly innovative work stream looking at how to track and identify manipulated and synthesized content in real time. Just to set the scene, could you give us an overview of how you see the evolution of manipulated and synthesized or deepfake content progressing in the next few years?
Sure. I mean, we've already seen a really rapid pace of change already. There's nothing to indicate that that's going to change, right? So, the first, some of the machine learning based approaches for generating fully synthetic faces are, really 5, 6, 7 years old. And we've seen dramatic improvement in the quality and the characteristics that are embedded in those sorts of faces. We've seen similar progression in video technology. We're starting to see it now in text, right? These large scale language models have the ability to generate compelling paragraphs, narratives, stories. And similarly, we're seeing things in audio technology as well. So, this pace of change, which has been dramatic, is just going to continue. It's driven by the academic research community. It's driven by commercial industry. There are positive uses for these sorts of technology. So it's not just that these are being developed for nefarious purposes. Longer term, these technologies may become so widely available that, we're essentially going to interact with their outputs on a daily basis. Imagine just highly customized, targeted emails, spam, social engineering, spear phishing attacks that people can do at a scale and a level of quality that is just not possible right now.
So following on from what we've already heard from Lindsay, how much of a risk is this from your perspective, from a national security perspective?
Yeah, I would actually broaden it beyond national security. I mean, obviously, there's significant concerns around elections and democratic decision-making, and liberal democracies have a particularly large attack surface here versus authoritarian governments that control the flow of information. But it's also commercial industry. Think about insurance companies. Mm-hmm. Think about banking and financial enterprises. Think about our trust in the scientific process, right? We've seen what happens when that's eroded in the context of COVID and the challenges around that. So it's not just national security. It's really the erosion of our trust in information writ large that's at stake.
Absolutely. Given that this encompasses the entire information ecosystem. Sam, you pioneer the use of video technology to protect human rights at witness. So further to Matt's remarks, could you also give us a view of what you think is really on the line here for humanity? And specifically, could you comment on the liar's dividend and how the proliferation of manipulated or synthetic media disproportionately affects marginalized community or at-risk communities?
Thank you, Nina. And so in our work at Witness, we deal with and support the people who are on the front lines of asserting truth and then also challenging falsehoods. So you see journalists worldwide, and we can see it in war zones like Myanmar now, or confronting police violence in Nigeria, having to create trustworthy information and having to challenge their own information being manipulated or misinformation being shared that targets them or their communities. So we have this triple threat that impacts the most vulnerable truth tellers in our societies. And it's the moment primarily is the types of videos and photos that Witness we call shallow fakes, just simply miscontextualized videos and photos, the types of things that content, authenticity, and provenance architecture can help you discern. And we've been starting to see the impact of both the fear of deepfakes and the reality of deepfakes to impact vulnerable populations. You see deepfakes targeting women, particularly women activists and journalists and public figures. And you also see people using what you call the liar's dividend, which is where someone claims that a video is false or claims that it's true and says, prove it's one way or the other. And basically, given the tools we have available in most of civil society, that's impossible. We were involved in a case recently in Myanmar where there was a national level politician who there was a video released by the government there. People thought it was a deepfake, but they had no way of telling. And you saw this undermining confidence in, can we tell what's true and false? How do we do that when the stakes are really high? So coming up with solutions that are applicable globally and available globally, and that's a really important thing that is central to the C2PA as well, is critical, and it's felt most extremely when you're on the front lines of defending truth in journalism and human rights globally.
So I don't think that there's any doubt that there's a problem. And given that detection of manipulated media, whether or not it's synthetically created, is not going to be a universal panacea, especially given the pace of change and the scale of change, I think we really need media provenance, but how does it actually work? So I'd like to come to you, Hani. Perhaps you could elucidate a little bit more on the technical aspect of media provenance. I mean, just because somebody asserts that a piece of media is from somewhere doesn't mean that it's the case. So what is secure media capture, and why is this fundamentally different from having to trust someone's word about where something came from?
Good. First of all, it's good to be here with you, Nina, and to share a stage with my esteemed colleagues here. So there's sort of two aspects to the C2PA that we should understand. So one is when you're dealing with an organization like Witness or the BBC that are trusted, we know who they are, they have editorial standards, then the default C2PA standard that says Sam is going to sign something and tell you that this has not been manipulated is a very nice way of dealing with provenance. But when I create an image or a video or an audio recording, I don't have editorial standards. Nobody knows who I am. And so how can I prove that this has not been manipulated as opposed to simply trust and know where it came from? And that's where secure recording comes from, or secure content recording comes from. And the idea is actually quite elegant and simple, which is that at the point of recording, typically on a mobile device these days, when you hit that record button, you grab the date and time, you grab the GPS location, you grab all the pixels, you create a hash or a digital compact signature, you cryptographically sign that, and essentially that is a stamp of authenticity being put either by the hardware or by the software at the point of recording. And nobody is in a better place to authenticate content than exactly at this point of recording. And that's why it's a very nice solution to what you and everybody has been saying is this enormous problem of trust online. And so then when I take a photo of, say, human rights violations or police brutality or a riot or a natural disaster or whatever it is, and I post it online with secure recordings, then there's no question. Now we can start having a discussion about what happened, not did it happen. And what's exciting about that technology is that it is something that could be deployed at the scale of 3 billion, 4 billion, 5 billion devices worldwide, which cannot be said about forensically analyzing yourself at the back end when things are being uploaded.
So if you can securely capture something at a source, at the origin of that piece of content, how about when that media is edited? And then secondly, does the C2PA open standard allow for both scenarios, securely capturing and already edited media?
So let me answer the second part first. Yes, the standard allows for both. And we wanted to come in with a very broad agenda. We didn't want to pigeonhole people into a very specific technology, which is why both are there. We also, and you've heard this in the beginning, the C2PA doesn't want to tell people what's true and what's not true. We want to enable people to reason about the material that they read online. And so the standard allows for both. And then we should also recognize that not all forms of editing of content are inherently deceptive or nefarious. I, for example, may take a photo and increase the contrast or white balance or crop or transcode it. And I should be allowed to do that without people questioning the fundamental nature of what is depicted in the content. And so the standard allows for tracking whatever has been done to the content. Yeah. And so if it's a crop, a brightness contrast, okay, fine. I now understand what that is, and I know that that is a relatively benign manipulation. On the other hand, if I went in with Adobe's very powerful content-aware replacing of content, or I manipulated somebody's face, well, then we have a different question. And the standard doesn't say, do this, don't do this. It simply says, if you do it, we must keep track of it. So again, people downstream can reason about the content in a trusted way.
So The C2PA spec illustrates that technically it's already possible to securely verify media at both inception and throughout its lifetime, like you just described the kind of chain of edits being attached to that piece of content. So if the technical challenge can be overcome, the next challenge is surely adoption. And, I'm coming to you next, Todd, as it strikes me that social media platforms, i.e. arguably the most important vehicle of human communication today, have a huge role to play. So first of all, thank you for being the only social media company on this panel today. And given that social media is so much about the decontextualization of information, can you give me a view of how Twitter is approaching media provenance?
Yes, and first off, thank you, Nina, and for the question, thank you to the Coalition for including Twitter on the panel today. We're proud members of the C2PA. I'd say the best way to understand our approach to our public approach to product development, particularly as threats and challenges arise in this election year, is to take a step back and look at how we prepared for 2020. You may recall right around Memorial Day 2019, there was a video, deepfake, of Speaker Pelosi that went viral on multiple platforms. At that time, provenance technology was not sufficiently developed. So this was a massive challenge for platforms such as ours. We originally thought that deepfakes, or as we call them at Twitter, synthetic and manipulated media, would be one of the primary challenges that we faced in 2020. And based on that hypothesis, we reached out to for public input and asked our users and experts in civil society and academia how we should handle these types of media. Should we simply remove them? Should we leave them up? Should we do something in between? Keeping in mind, as I said, or as we've all said, our role isn't to be the ultimate arbiters of truth. Overwhelmingly, respondents wanted more context, preferring that we leave content up but provide useful context to help them understand what they're viewing. At the same time, I will note more than 90% of people who shared feedback with us did say that in some circumstances, they do want us to remove content if there is a particular kind of harm associated with it in certain circumstances. But moving forward to March 2020, when the pandemic struck, we made a decision as a company to expand our existing product framework to support the labeling and providing of context on tweets that may contain misleading information about COVID. Later in 2020, we expanded that yet again to help stop the spread of harmful misinformation that could suppress the vote or compromise the integrity of the election. So I would say that as a part of our existing enforcement approach, tweets that are labeled under this policy framework have their visibility reduced across the service. That's part of our responsible management of our platform, which means that we will not amplify those tweets on a number of surfaces across Twitter. I am glad to say that we've seen evidence that our approach to misinformation is working. The use of labels and warnings has significantly reduced engagement with misleading content on our platform. We will continue to experiment, iterate, and build in public on that existing infrastructure to address the challenges and threats as they arise, both domestically and across the globe. So, go ahead.
So do you see a future then, a near future where users will scroll through social media and they'll find that all the media that they're engaging with will have known provenance information and edits attached?
Well, the exciting thing about today is that now that we have a 1.0 spec, we can take a good close look at whether and how it can help us elevate the public conversation online at Twitter. And our partners in industry can do the same thing and evaluate whether and how to integrate this technology.
Thank you. So I'd just like to move on perhaps to kind of the utility of this open standard, because this is obviously opt-in by nature, but in my view, it will cascade because of its sheer utility. So I'd like to ask each member of my panel how they see media provenance working in their own respective fields. So perhaps coming to you first, Matt. We know that your work at DARPA was designed to tackle falsified multimodal assets, so detection. But what gaps does provenance fill in your work in a national security context?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are complementary technologies, really. I mean, one of the challenges with the provenance approach is you're not going to necessarily get bad actors to adopt them. But as they become more commonly used, what it's going to do is surface those bad actors. They're going to be easier to find because they're going to be the folks that are perhaps avoiding using the content authenticity approaches. So, I think there are a suite of areas, in the short-term journalism community, some of the financial, other aspects of the business community have a real pressing need for these sorts of technologies. So, again, that gets after the complementary nature. I really appreciate the fact that the spec is open source. That enables us to collaborate. There are hybrid approaches where we can combine some of the detection technology along with provenance to deal with cases where, maybe media traversed a platform that didn't actually implement the spec yet. Is there something we can do to span that sort of gap? So by having the standard be open, that allows us to have that sort of collaboration. I think it's also just fundamentally important for a spec that relates to the integrity of information to allow people to inspect it, to understand how it's implemented, things like that. So that level of transparency for certain users and certain consumers is going to be really important. So again, happy to see that there's an open source version of the spec.
Brilliant. Sam, perhaps you could comment a little bit on Witness's work with the C2PA and what you're doing to ensure that this technology and open standard remains accessible to the most vulnerable and marginalized communities.
Thank you, Nina. I think Witness came into this after a decade of work trying to think about the pros and cons of coming up with these types of solutions to misinformation and trustworthy information. And so we've led within the C2PA something called the Threats, Harms and Misuses Task Force, which has really tried to proactively say, how could this go wrong and how do we mitigate that? And embedded in the C2PA from the guiding principles upwards, we've seen attention to try and get that right. And so, I think legitimately when people look at these standards, they ask questions like, will this protect the privacy of vulnerable people or people who cannot reveal some data about themselves for either personal reasons or contextual reasons in the countries they live? And so there's been a real effort to try and build a system that allows for options where people can have identities that are not necessarily revealed. Provenance doesn't have to be about the identity of the person. It can be about how a piece of media is changed, as well as to allow certain types of information to be redacted. So very concretely, we have to think in a real world context about particularly privacy and particularly around access. And I think there have been decisions in the design to think about some fairly well-tested existing types of technologies and also to make it open source to enable people to build for a diverse ecosystem globally. So as we look ahead, I think it's really important this attention continues. I think it's been a really powerful component of the C2PA that it has been subject to this scrutiny from the start. And I think that bodes well for the future, that we can build a system that enhances the truth tellers like I was describing at the start, we've all been talking about, but also recognizes that there are the ways in which these technologies can be weaponized against vulnerable people. And so the only final point I would add there, which we're attentive to, is, there's certainly, as you look around the world, a tend to want to legislate around standards. And in many countries, that's happening in an abusive way towards free expression and privacy. So there's going to be a thin line to walk in terms of these types of specifications and standards to get it right as a way to have better trust in content, to make it a useful tool for consumers in this environment you described of increasingly manipulated media, both synthetically and with much more conventional techniques, while avoiding the risks that this could be used, for example, to target people's privacy, to target journalists and others who use it. So it's really important we walk that line, and so far the C2PA has been very attentive to that, so it's a good start.
Brilliant. Todd, you commented on the use of decontextualized and manipulated media in the 2020 election, and we know we have another contentious midterm election coming up this year. I know you already started going into some detail about how Twitter is preparing for misinformation and other forms of decontextualized media in 2022. So perhaps you could just elaborate a little bit further on that, and perhaps you would also be able to comment on whether Twitter has had a chance to engage, raise provenance with any policymakers and legislators, and if you found that they have been engaging.
Well, first of all, I'd like to say we think this is going to require a whole of society approach. So we are glad as a coalition to be working with leaders like Senator Portman and Senator Peters in their capacity at the Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, as well as I look forward to taking up Lindsay's offer on discussing with the administration how private sector can work with the executive branch on addressing the reliability of information that consumers encounter online. So again, their whole of society approach, we're going to continue to work with stakeholders in civil society and in the academy on not just addressing the challenge of misinformation, but also elevating reliable information, including in places like the including on places like our elections hub at Twitter, so that the public can see reliable, verified information regarding when and how to vote. And we're going to continue to work with people like local elections administrators to make sure they're getting the most out of our platform. So again, we see roles for the public sector, we see roles for civil society, and roles for policymakers in all three, in both the legislative and executive branches. And we are going to continue to do everything we can, both to address harmful information and make credible, reliable information more widely available. And, you know, this is critical here in the United States in 2022 as we have a major midterm election, but it's always election year at Twitter, and we are hard at work to address these challenges, be they here domestically in the United States, be they in Brazil with their elections coming up, or wherever that might be.
Thank you. We don't have time for much more, but I would like to put a final question to Hani. We've discussed, Hani, media provenance, mostly in the context of national security, human rights, and democracy. But this is something that Matt mentioned right at the top. It strikes me that this is vital for the future of the digital economy and for consumer protection too. Could you comment on that, please, Hani?
I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that this issue has the potential to disrupt democracies, societies, economies, individual lives across the board. So here's just one example. I created a deepfake of Mark Zuckerberg saying Facebook profits are down 20%. They're not. I let that go viral. How quickly can I move the market to the tune of billions of dollars before anybody sorts it out? Small scale, Matt already pointed to this, phishing scams, spams, things that are highly targeted to individuals are going to disrupt our economy. Insurance companies, think about all the e-commerce we do and how much we have to trust. Not just the website that we go to, but the content. So these are huge existential threats to economies, societies, and democracies. I think we have been slow to respond in the last decade, but I'm excited about the work that the C2PA is doing, the work that Matt is doing with DARPA with this huge team of academics and researchers around the country. I think there's a lot of work to be done, but this is absolutely the right and necessary first step in that direction.
And I know I said it was the last question, but I will ask you one more. Have you also been finding that policymakers and legislators have been engaging with media provenance solutions that you've been building at the C2PA?
Good. I'm encouraged both on Capitol Hill, in Brussels, in the UK, and Australia, and Canada, and other parts of the world that I've talked with legislators, that they are aware that there is a problem. We don't all agree on the exact nature of the problem. We don't agree on the exact solutions, but I think there is this awareness that these are big threats to our societies and democracies. There is more, not just awareness, but a real understanding of the nature of the problem and what the solution landscape is looking like. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of thoughtful, modest regulation that does more benefit than harm. We always have to be careful there. But yes, I would say both here and abroad, our regulators are really trying to figure out how we can make the technology and the internet work for us and not against us.
Well, that's a brilliant way to end the panel. I wish we had more time, but just to summarize, I think we all agree that this is an immense issue. We live in a world where the digital information ecosystem encompasses almost all human communication, whether it's commercial, political, or personal. And if we cannot ensure trust in any of these interactions, then surely we are staring into an abyss. So it's critical that we address and solve this problem, and it's my firm belief that digital content provenance is a huge step forward towards that end. So I'm so pleased that the C2PA and its members have already developed this flexible open standard, which can be used in numerous scenarios, each with different priorities anywhere across the internet. So without further ado, let's get to it. I would now like to invite everyone to watch a demonstration of the C2PA's open standard. Remember, this is only the first iteration, and I'd also like to remind you that there will be a chance to ask questions. So if you already have any other questions, please do type them into the chat. After we watch the video, we will have a chance for Q&A. So over to the team. Let's watch the demo.
Some C2PA partners have already created initial implementations of secure media provenance tools. This video will review what the C2PA standard does and see examples of its use in both still photos and video applications. The C2PA specification works by binding provenance information to a piece of media throughout its entire journey. From the initial moment of creation through to every edit made, its actions and history can be captured and recorded, bound together, signed and sealed, travelling with it wherever it goes, creating a tamper-evident record that can be inspected and validated by a consumer or downstream technical process. The C2PA standard will work with many forms of media, such as photos, video and audio. Let's take a look at how it works, using photos as an example. Someone takes a photo using a camera with C2PA running on it. Its provenance information, such as location, photographer, date, is captured and recorded. The photo is uploaded for processing and digitally signed by the publisher, asserting their claim to the photo. This is recorded too. The photo, its information and identity assertions are cryptographically sealed together into a tamper-evident manifest, bound to the piece of content for its life. A consumer sees the photo in their social media feed and can now click on the content credentials icon to inspect the image. They can see all of the provenance information recorded on the manifest. They use this to validate their trust in the image. An edit needs to be made to the photo. A designer opens up the photo and makes their changes. They create a new manifest, declaring their changes in an additional set of assertions. This new manifest is recorded and digitally signed. It's added to the previous manifest, bound to the photo and sealed. A consumer sees this new photo in their social media feed, but is not sure they can trust that the image is genuine. They see the content credentials icon and click to inspect. They can see all of the provenance information from the manifest at a glance, or examine every historic manifest detail. They use this to establish their trust in the image. Let's take a closer look at a piece of content and its journey to understand how the C2PA provenance solution will work. A photographer in New York takes a photo of the Brooklyn Bridge. His camera is set up with TruePic software, which is running a C2PA implementation. So as soon as he takes the photo, it securely records all of the photo's provenance information into a manifest and binds it together with the photo using a tamper-evident cryptographic signature. The photo lands on the desk of an editor for the New York Times. They want to use it for an article they're writing, so inspect the manifest. Happy with the authenticity of the photo, they open it in Photoshop to prepare it for publish. The changes they make are automatically captured by Photoshop and recorded into a new manifest, which is added to the photo's provenance chain. It is now ready for publishing. Someone downloads the published photo from the New York Times and decides to edit it further before posting on social media. The provenance information is always present, locked to the photo, ready to be inspected on any platform anywhere. Every bit of its journey recorded from every edit, all the way back to the original photographer. Viewers can inspect the content's full provenance history to see the additional information about each edit. If edits are made in a system without the C2PA specification, then the consumer is notified by a missing or incomplete message in the content credentials. C2PA also uses a failsafe for recovery in case of the malicious or accidental stripping of provenance information. It can always be recovered and matched again to the photo. By comparing the changes made along the way, viewers get a more complete picture of how the content came to be. The C2PA specification has been designed to support a range of media formats, including video. The Ravna content management platform runs in the Microsoft Azure cloud and uses Azure Media Services to publish videos with content provenance information based on the C2PA standard. Ravna hides the complexity of the content provenance technology behind a simple user interface that adds no additional manual steps to the daily video processing and publishing pipeline. Identity management is done using the Microsoft Azure Key Vault. A one-time setup simplifies the secure storage of the key certificates that will be used to sign video files. Common information that will be attached to all published media, such as organisation details, can be loaded once and consistently applied. To publish a C2PA video, it is uploaded to Microsoft Azure Media Services, along with any specific assertions the publisher wants to securely include. This may be dates, location, or other information which describes the video. As always, this information is optional. As with the previous photo example, the editor's desired information is added to a manifest that's included in the final video. This is a background process that proceeds without adding incremental efforts to existing workflows. Mecklenburg County, North Carolina, wants to ensure that their citizens can trust the integrity of their published media. They publish their Board of County Commissioners meetings online using C2PA-based Ravna and Azure Media Services to simply deliver secure video coverage. As the Ravna C2PA player loads a video, it inspects it for provenance information. When playback detects a valid provenance manifest, it adds a status indicator to the screen to indicate valid security check. When we hover on the player, a small icon in the upper right corner indicates the presence of a manifest. Clicking on the icon shows a summary of the claim included in the manifest. In this case, it confirms the video was published by Mecklenburg County. Expanding the window displays the additional assertions the publisher chose to include and add context to the user's experience. What happens if a video has been tampered with or has a corrupted or missing manifest? The icon will turn yellow and the info panel will inform the viewer that the authenticity cannot be verified because of incomplete or invalid provenance data. C2PA provides alerts for non-compliant media, but does not impede consumption. Trust decisions always remain the choice of an informed consumer. Once configured, the C2PA process augments media security without requiring additional manual effort by media creators or consumers. The examples shown are early implementations of the C2PA specification. This ecosystem of compatible media management tools will grow as the open C2PA specification gains wide adoption. The C2PA process gives media creators and publishers the ability to simply add an optional security layer to their work. Downstream processors and the consuming public can feel confident knowing that the content is unaltered and from whom it says it's from. This added security and transparency reinforces trust in a digital media environment where synthetic and manipulated media are a growing threat. The C2PA is a diverse group of media and technology companies working together to preserve trust in digital media. We welcome your participation.
Right, a lot of food for thought there. Now, we are very lucky to have a second brilliant panel to take questions on the open standard. They all help lead their respective companies' engagement with the C2PA. And I'll introduce them all very briefly. Again, I will not be able to do them justice because we have to jump straight into Q&A. We don't have that much time. So we have Andrew Jenks, who's the Principal Program Manager of Azure Media Security at Microsoft. He is also the C2PA's Steering Committee Chairman. We have Nick Brown, who is the VP of Product at TruePic. We have Judy Parnell, who is the Head of Standards and Industry at the BBC. And finally, we have Andy Parsons, who is the Director of the Content Authenticity Initiative at Adobe. So I will be coming to you first, Andrew. How do you plan to block or mitigate the challenge of scammers to portray themselves as a trusted source or some, by pretending to be something like a local authority?
I think that's a very fine line we have to walk, right? Because as you've heard many people say throughout today, there's nothing inherently wrong with synthesized content. There's nothing inherently wrong with content and misinformation. What there is something wrong with is not knowing that that content is misinformation and where it came from. And so what we have to make sure we do is allow for broad adoptability of this technology and of this standard while still maintaining things like journalistic integrity. And so C2PA is producing the specifications and standards that allows for media provenance to be broadly interoperable. We're looking to other organizations such as Project Origin and CAI to establish the kind of rules and regulations of the road. How do we think about when provenance is applied and when provenance is not applied to media? And so you'll be able to sign media as a local authority. What's important is that you be able to trace that back and say this person or this entity signed it as local media. We're also investigating reputational management capabilities within the specification so that other users and other entities can have the ability to provide feedback on pieces of content and say, this thing isn't really what this thing says it is.
Thank you. Nick, coming to you next as the VP of Product at TruePic, with obviously you have developed Secure Capture at TruePic. With Secure Capture, what's to stop someone putting an original hashtag with metadata on a picture that they don't own?
Thanks, Nina. Yeah, that's a really great question. I think when you heard Hani talk about Secure Capture earlier, and you heard that there was kind of two different ways that the C2PA could be implemented, there's a really important difference that we've allowed for with the flexibility of C2PA, in that in a lot of the different claims that are signed, you're doing it as an individual, and you are individually standing behind that. With Secure Capture, we've purposely made it so that there can be a level of objectivity there. It's actually a piece of software or hardware that is cryptographically signing those claims into that file. And so us at TruePic, we've kind of developed this concept of Secure Capture. We've worked really, really hard to make sure that we're not just taking any piece of information or photo that's injected into the system, but instead we are going to great lengths to independently verify all the different details that we're then cryptographically signing into that file. And so because of that and that level of objectivity, it means that that point of capture with that capture, edit, publish tripod that exists, it really sets the stage for the point of origin of provenance that then can grow beyond that point. And because it is done by a piece of software or hardware, it really can't be faked because we're doing it in a really, really specific private way.
Thank you. Judy, coming to you next, perhaps you could comment on this. Just because the data attached to a piece of media is preserved doesn't mean that it can't be faked. So how do you know that a piece of media is an accurate depiction of something, even if it's authentic? For example, a picture of a body covered in blood could be a staged image with a C2PA standard, but not really a dead body. How do you think about that from the news perspective?
Well, it's one of the things we've been talking about, Nina, that actually what we're trying to prove is where it came from, not the actual content itself. We're not evidencing the truth of the content, we're evidencing the truth of the path that has got there to it. So yes, it could be faked. It's a very valid reason sometimes why content is faked, but the things to do is actually to provide people with those clues to help them to work it out themselves, to answer the questions. As Todd from Twitter was saying, people actually want to know, where does my content come from? Where did it originate? They want to actually ask those questions and to examine them. We've had lots of examples, for instance, of pieces of video being shown from a riot. And people have said, well, this happened 2 days ago in this city. Well, and actually, when you dig down and when our fact checkers go and have a look at it, actually you can find that same piece of content 10 years ago from a completely different part of the world and a completely different conflict, and it changes the whole news story. How empowering is that if every citizen can see that information and actually test it for themselves? Not everyone will, but actually that's something that's really empowering. You can start to evidence that and also get the trust based on who we are and knowing who that's come from. Building up on that reputation.
And I suppose that's all the more relevant. And I know some of the speakers today have already raised that, in a future where masses of content is going to be synthesized and not all of it will be malign, much of it is going to be benign, just simply identifying whether something is authentic or faked is really not the point. But coming to you, Andy, next. What do you say to those who say, isn't this just a form of surveillance? How is privacy maintained through the capture of GPS location, for instance?
Yeah, thanks, Nina. Looking at all these great questions coming from the audience. I wish we had an hour for Q&A, but I'll do my best on this one. I could speak for half an hour just on this. Yeah, privacy is one of the foremost guiding principles of the C2PA, Content Authenticity Initiative, and Project Origin, which came together to comprise it. And these are published publicly. You can read through all the principles. I'd say one of the most important one among them, of course, is privacy. I'd start by saying this is all intended to be opt-in. And in fact, the guidance documents, the UX task force, which I've co-chaired for the past year, looks very carefully at ensuring that users of the technology on the producer or the creator side understand what they're doing, when this should be used, and when it shouldn't be used. So the combination of having the whole system be opt-in, this is not required on a device or a camera or Photoshop or any other tool of manipulation for good or malign purposes. Second is to make sure people are educated and understand what these tools are for, when they should be used and when they shouldn't be used. And third, I'd point out that in the specification, in the normative provisions of the specification, it's made very clear that the minimal claim in the C2PA is nothing more than a timestamp and some cryptographic digital signature information. And to Judy's earlier point, even that minimal claim saying this was created at this particular time addresses an entire class of misinformation where things are simply taken out of their temporal context. And there are others as well. For example, if you trust the BBC and its sourcing methods, simply knowing that something was signed and delivered by the BBC eliminates yet another class of potential misinformation and spread of misinformation. And neither of those compromise privacy. Everything else is accretive to those. If it is important to show identity or show GPS locations, those things can be opted into. And finally, one last point, because we think quite a bit about that. I hope that's evident in my answer. There's a notion of redaction that's baked into the core of the spec. So if information that should not be shared is accidentally shared, it can be redacted downstream by an editor or a photographer or videographer. And that sort of provision for redaction does not compromise the cryptographic certainty of what has gone before, but does allow for the removal of information in situations where it must not be shared.
And finally, I will add one last question, and this is open to anyone on the panel because I'm afraid we have so little time to hear more from you. But my final question is whether or not tech companies should have an obligation to at least offer content provenance on their platforms. What does my panel think of that?
I'll jump in first and maybe take the most obvious answer away from others. But I think obligation is a strong word. I would say that if there is to be an obligation or legislation or other types of mandates, The C2PA members, I think I speak on behalf of all of us here, want to make sure that a standard exists, that there's one such standard, and that it's common across all geographies, companies, human rights organizations, et cetera. So if there is to be an obligation, there is a standard common way to fulfill it.
And I'd like to just add with the analogy of the HTTPS padlock. It's not mandated, but it has become almost universal. Everyone knows what it means, and they see it and they trust it, and therefore people use it. And I think that's a fantastic way to go.
And like HTTPS, we'll see implementations driven by needs represented by consumers, needs represented by media companies and by others. And as those needs arise and become a chorus of requests for this capability, tech companies will naturally follow, I think, without specific mandates.
And I'll chime in and just say that I think that although this standard maybe shouldn't be an obligation, there is an obligation for all companies and all tech companies to protect both themselves and their consumers. And this being a really, really good open standard to kickstart that process to create trust in media across the internet, once again, it really is a good thing for everybody to engage in and take a careful look at, because consumer safety is at risk here, and we do have to preserve it however we can.
Thank you, Nick. That is a brilliant place to end the Q&A. I know we weren't able to answer all questions, but hopefully we'll be able to have another event soon. But I would now like to hand over and introduce Jamie Angus. He's the Senior Controller of News Output and Commissioning at the BBC. He's also the chair of the Trusted News Initiative, which brings together both tech platforms and trusted news publishers to work together to fight disinformation. Over to you, Jamie, for closing remarks, and thank you very much to the panel for the Q&A.
Well, thank you so much, Nina, and thank you to all our guests this evening. I hope you can hear me this evening. It's a pleasant early evening coda for me for what's been a very busy news day. I'm speaking to you from the heart of our multimedia newsroom here in London, a newsroom dealing with stories around anti-vaccination, public health, the integrity of democracies, a political crisis, two nations on the verge of war, and that's literally just today's running order. So from that description, you can see exactly how important to us the integrity of our news product is. And I just wanted to say a little bit why it matters so much to newsrooms. Our product and its value to audiences is built on trust. And if we lose that trust, it is almost impossible to recover. And so the way that the technical solutions you are working on reinforce the trust of news brands like the BBC and others working together in this coalition is incredibly important. It also plays, of course, to the safety of journalists who are operating in very difficult and dangerous environments. Journalists from a number of major international news organizations and, of course, freelance colleagues operated in places like Syria, currently in Ukraine, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, and other parts of the world where journalists are significantly at risk, particularly if their work is maliciously misrepresented. So that's why this matters. We live in a world dominated by video, and my radio colleagues, and I speak as someone who's worked on the radio for at least half of my career, will forgive me for saying this, but our world is dominated by video content. And as people have already said this evening, people trust their eyes. Our audiences trust their eyes, and sadly, sometimes they shouldn't. This is a tough message for news organizations. And it's really, really important that we have the kind of technical solutions that we've explored here this evening to back up our underlying message of trust. I'm particularly impressed to see the depth of collaboration between journalists working on the C2PA and our technical peers. You know, sometimes the relationship between journalists and their tech colleagues is it's like the boiler in your house. You only notice it when it goes wrong. But I really feel that over the last 10 years in particular, as news has pivoted into the digital age, we have to necessarily and creatively work so much more closely together engineers and product specialists and journalists. And this is a really, really good example of that. You know, in the analog 1-0 broadcasting world, our technology was simple. It was a pipe that delivered content directly to audiences. And if they were on the end of the pipe, they kind of knew what they were getting. But everything is so different now in the digital age. Increasingly, I feel that for news organizations, our digital product is our content. The two are immutable and interchangeable, particularly in the way that they support trust from audiences. Someone earlier on the call talked about technology needing to embody the values of a news organization or a content publisher. And that's a really interesting and challenging concept, isn't it? Technology with values is not necessarily what we sometimes think about, but I think the work that's been done here in the C2PA so far and going forward into the years to come will show how a technology product can embody the values that we all feel so strongly about. So in summary, this is a coalition. The clue is in the title. I'd encourage people watching this evening who haven't been involved so far and would like to get involved, please join with us. The C2PA rests on a willing coalition of people coming together who share the same values across technology platforms and content publishers. And we're really, really excited to see all of the progress that's going to be made in the years to come. You know, I feel when we first discussed this idea 2 or 3 years ago here in New Broadcasting House in the council chamber, this was just the germ of an idea, and now our creation is starting to take its first steps in the real world. I was incredibly impressed to see the video that we saw and to hear the discussion from all the contributors this evening. So from London, all best wishes to everyone who's joined this evening, and good luck for the work of the coalition in the year to come. Thanks very much. Good evening.